Hello, I'm Helen from Ingentium Limited, and I'm here today to talk about knowledge exchange and transfer. Ingentium have worked closely with Defend to understand how knowledge exchange and transfer activities are carried out amongst its consortium members, and how these activities can be improved upon to build sustainable knowledge assets which are beneficial for both internal and external parties. The objective of this training video is to equip you with the knowledge and tools that will firstly help you identify knowledge assets whilst understanding how they relate to intellectual property or IP assets. Secondly, help you feel confident navigating a knowledge exchange framework, learning to recognise what is required at key stages when considering knowledge assets. And lastly, help you consider how you can implement practical approaches at an individual and organisational level to manage knowledge assets and improve knowledge exchange and transfer activities. First of all, let's establish why knowledge exchange and transfer is important and why this video is worth 15 minutes of your attention. First, we must think of knowledge exchange in a broader context, beyond more than just publishing scientific work in scientific journals. Knowledge exchange affects the degree of impact your research can have for society's benefit. The knowledge assets derived from your research can, for example, influence future funding that you may receive, open up new opportunities for collaboration with industry, inform government policy, and lead to incremental and blockbuster innovations which solve problems and benefit society as a whole. Furthermore, let us not forget that in most cases, research impact is an obligation that fund recipients have to their funder. In order to achieve maximum research impact through knowledge exchange and transfer activities, knowledge assets need to be identified and communicated effectively. Let's now move to considering a knowledge exchange and transfer, or KET, framework and what it means in the context of scientific research. This is the Defend KET framework, which we will refer to in this video. However, we should note that KET frameworks may look different in other organisations. The framework should be regarded as a structure with a series of stages associated to knowledge creation, adaptation, and finally dissemination. In the first stage, we're focusing on the opportunities around knowledge and identifying what elements of the research done and knowledge created could be shared or transferred. In the second stage, we consider the manners in which to share that knowledge so that it achieves maximum impact, whether, for example, it should be published in Nature or promoted on a Facebook page devoted to a niche audience group. And in the final stage, we're finally considering how our knowledge has been used and impacted its intended audience. I've used the term knowledge asset quite a bit so far, so let's explore what knowledge assets are and how they're related to intellectual assets, sometimes also called intellectual property or IP assets, a term which some of you may already be familiar with. The reality is that there's not much of a difference between the terms knowledge assets or IP assets, other than perspective. Both a knowledge asset as well as an IP asset are intangible, as in you cannot touch them, and they're derived from a person's or an organisation's work or creativity. These assets can be new processes and methods, databases, or even something as simple as contents for a brochure. The main difference between knowledge assets and IP assets is that the former is often considered from a sharing perspective, in that knowledge assets are usually disseminated in a controlled way through documents, presentations and publications, whilst IP assets are viewed from a protectionist perspective. IP assets are in fact knowledge assets, which may have substantial and leverageable value and therefore need to be legally protected. This is why, when considering IP assets, we often refer to various forms of legal rights, such as patents, copyright, and trade secrets, to name a few. In this video, our primary focus is on knowledge assets from a sharing perspective, and particularly those knowledge assets that are often core to research, and these are know-how, databases and software, and organisational knowledge. Let us start off with know-how. Know-how pertains to technical or practical knowledge resulting from research or experience, and usually relates to the way that something is done. When we consider know-how, we usually refer to knowledge that is not widely known and is perhaps unique in certain ways. Nonetheless, know-how is one of the most common yet underrated knowledge assets within research settings. Examples of know-how can be reagent formulation, for example, a recipe; new or more efficient methods or processes, for example, a new ELISA method for field testing. It could be insights or access to a network of trusted individuals or partners who provide strategic benefit. It could be a novel purification method. But keep in mind, know-how that's generated in one research team could turn out to have further value if it's shared with others or adapted for another process. It has a significant amount of pivot value if it's used wisely. It's important then to consider what would happen to know-how which is unrecorded if it remains in the head of a member of staff which was to leave. And this could mean that such knowledge assets, no matter how trivial or significant, they're permanently lost. And it could have profound impact on efficiency and productivity, and ultimately may diminish the long-term impact. And because of this, it's important to think about how know-how can be recorded formally so that it could be built upon, shared with others, and leveraged in the future. One thing to consider in the context of know-how, and remember this is generally technical and practical knowledge that's widely unknown, is the extent to which this knowledge asset may be sensitive and confidential, and whether it should or should not be shared externally. Such know-how may have commercial value, and it could be protected as a trade secret or even patented, particularly if this will improve the chances for sustainable impact through commercial pathways. While sensitivity will always depend on the objectives of your research, the partners that you involve, and the markets which your research intends to benefit, you should always apply a sensitivity test prior to sharing know-how, which could be regarded as an important knowledge asset, whether it's for informal or formal discussion with someone external to your organisation or consortium. Now we're going to move on to talk about software, data and databases. Naturally, many research groups in the life sciences are now relying on coding, data and databases to design models, analyse information and store their data. And we should note that in the EU and in the UK, software can be protected by copyright, while databases can be protected by copyright and sui generis database rights. Sui generis rights are a unique right that aims to recognise the investment that was made into compiling a database, in other words, its contents. Let me emphasise that there is quite a lot of value in these kinds of knowledge assets. Let's consider a scenario where you and your group have developed custom software which carries out data mining with a unique algorithm component which draws together multiple data sets for modelling disease. In such a scenario, not only has a significant time been invested into bringing together, or perhaps even generating the data sets, but the effort that has been placed into creating these systems which can parse and analyse such data to make it more useful to the end user. The contents of such a database may attract sui generis or database rights, while the underlying software will gain automatic copyright. As part of the KET process, it is important to consider whether such data can be made available to broader research audiences and how it can be interrogated or used to achieve the greatest impact. Furthermore, you must also consider how your investment should be recognised. Would it be simply through an acknowledgement or through an obligation to contribute new findings to the original dataset, thereby enhancing it over time? Ultimately, what is most important to understand is that in a world where digitisation is a driver for nearly everything, datasets and software can provide a lot of value, both in terms of research and reputation, depending on the manner in which they're packaged and presented. Now let's turn to organisational knowledge. Organisational knowledge refers to the sum of all knowledge within an organisation or a consortium such as Defend, which can provide business value. Note that when I say business value, I do not necessarily mean financial value. It could be value in terms of improving decision making, learning, efficiency and innovation to achieve organisational objectives. Organisational knowledge can consist of various recorded information based on personal or group experiences. So it can be information such as manuals, particular processes or ways of doing things, recorded know-how, standard operating procedures, or even brochures and informational videos. Organisational knowledge can be consumed internally if it can be accessed by others, such as your colleagues in Defend, or it can be communicated externally. A good example of organisational knowledge being communicated externally as part of a KET process is that of Defend's Dr. Zelanova's research on lumpy skin disease and African swine fever. Dr. Zelanova visited vets, farmers and members of communities in Azerbaijan to discuss her Defend project, as well as educate the public on disease control and vaccinations. Organisational knowledge developed by Dr. Zelanova and others at Defend was adapted to suit both a technical and a layman audience, and it was disseminated in meetings and through translated booklets and seminars. Dr. Zelanova also visited a microbiology lab where she shared information about microscopy to laboratory staff and collaborated with a local dairy farm, which led to them signing a memorandum with a central reference lab for lumpy skin disease ELISA tests, and this ensured the long-term sustainable impact of her research work. The most important thing to consider with organisational knowledge is its recording, storing and sharing, and how this can be best achieved. These factors are so important that the ISO 9001 standard for quality management within organisations actually acknowledges the significance of organisational knowledge and its ability to influence future success factors. It's therefore always essential that knowledge is prepared in such a way that it can be easily identified, understood and accessed by users, both internally and externally. The way this is done, however, is up to you to determine. Now, I promised in the beginning of this video to present practical approaches that can be taken to manage knowledge exchange and transfer within a group such as Defend. A knowledge asset register, for example. Let's refer back to the knowledge exchange framework that we reviewed earlier. Stage 1 was concerned with how effective we can be in identifying and creating opportunity for our internal knowledge to be exchanged or transferred. Therefore, the primary activity that must be taking place here is the identification and recording of knowledge assets as they are generated. One very easy and effective way of doing this is by maintaining a knowledge asset register, which can be held either centrally for the entire consortium or by your research group. A member of your team, for example, could act as a KET champion and would be responsible for recording knowledge assets as they arise and categorising them in terms of the type of knowledge asset, the associated intellectual property rights, potential uses and their overall sensitivity. A knowledge asset register doesn't need to be complicated. It can be something as simple as an Excel workbook with various relevant informational columns included that can be completed by the champion. And in due course, it can be upgraded to be a full online knowledge management system which can serve as a centralised repository that facilitates storage, organisation and sharing of information. Used internally, such a platform can allow colleagues to collaborate and build on each other's knowledge assets. And used externally, it provides stakeholders with a self-service resource where they can learn about research findings, access informational material and know who to contact if they have any specific questions. In stage 2 of the knowledge exchange framework, we want to consider how well we have adapted knowledge so it can be properly disseminated. And as much as research is rewarded by publications, there are various factors that must be considered in order to determine how knowledge can be best communicated internally and externally. For example, internally we must consider whether users of a knowledge asset may need information presented to them in a different way in order for it to make sense, which is particularly important in a multidisciplinary environment. Externally, we must consider the intended knowledge user's language and their cultural requirements, their access to resources and their level of technical understanding, amongst other things. A standardised process document, which creators of knowledge assets within Defend can run through to determine the best approaches to adapting and delivering knowledge, would be a particularly useful tool to help researchers both diversify their KET channels but also consider nuances which they would ensure that the knowledge that they share achieves the greatest impact. In stage 3 of the KET framework, we considered how effectively our knowledge has positively impacted our target audience, be it our colleagues or externally the public, other academics or policymakers. This is in fact an internal evaluation of how well we have shared our knowledge and whether there's anything that can be done better based on your experience. Setting internal key performance indicators to measure the success of KET and its impact, and auditing the performance on an annual basis is a great way to both evaluate progress and measure your success. This could take the form of reviewing the number of internal training sessions you've held, counting citations of publications and other articles, measuring online engagements, counting the number of impressions in the media, or understanding what new initiatives were born through the sharing of your knowledge with third parties, for example, new community groups, policy subcommittees, and so forth. There are many other steps that organisations can take in order to perfect KET, but the important thing to always keep in mind is that the process of knowledge exchange does not need to be complex, but should aim to follow a framework for it to work effectively. Simply by being more conscious of the value of knowledge assets and the importance of KET for the benefit of your colleagues as well as for the benefit of society, these are easy first steps that everyone can take in order to ensure that their research work achieves long-term sustainable impact. I hope that within the last 15 minutes that you have gained a fresh perspective on knowledge assets and the importance of knowledge and exchange and transfer within Defend, as well as with external stakeholders. If you require any further information on anything that you have heard, then please consult our website or email us directly.